A big part of collecting action figures is displaying action figures, which is why stands are really important. And there's a lot of different types. And as someone who's worked in the toy industry, I actually can bring some interesting perspective. The first thing we have to talk about, we have to ask questions about holes.
How many holes do you have?
Well, more where are and are there holes for figures? Now, usually they're at the bottom of the feet, and this is used to put them in, well, I guess, floor bases with pegs on them. We'll get more into that in a moment. Now, there are some action figures that can be displayed with a different hole, and that's one usually done through the back, sometimes as like that Wonder Woman that had a clip around her waist. It could also be plugged into the back so you don't see the clip. But traditionally, floor-based peg systems are what you see with most action figures. And sometimes action figures come packaged with stands. Sometimes the stands even have an action feature that's incorporated, like the Comtech figures from the tail end of Power of the Force 2 and Episode 1. But most of the time, a stand is kind of an extra piece of tchotch that's thrown in with a figure, sometimes to give increased value, sometimes perceived value. A stand can offer a lot with very little investment. And using the peg system as a universal way of getting most 6-inch and below figures to stand upright, well, universally, it means that most figures can work with most stands. While there's different sizes and there's different places you can place the peg, having a universal peg to hole, with the hole being in the figure's foot, as opposed to the other way around, has basically been standardized since the 1980s. I did work on a stand in Masters of the Universe Classics where we allowed the end user to move the peg around on the base, which I thought was pretty innovative. But this just harkens back to the play sets that I had in the 80s that had pegs built right into them. An interesting, I guess, challenge that I faced when I was working on the DC toy line at Mattel was the Justice League figures. Now, these guys were usually in waiting for the bus pose and tended to fall over. Now, we had to develop a exclusive stand just for working with these figures, where they would slip into the stand kind of like a slipper or a shoe. There was a peg as well, because a lot of the early figures did have pegs and even came with stands packaged with them, like the launch line, where you could spell out the word Justice League and stand your figure up using a peg. Then, at the tail end of the line, we made sure all of the figures had pegs again so they could work with even the universal clear stands. But the middle figures, there was a couple years there where there were no holes in the bottom of their feet. So you had a mix of figures with holes and without holes. I mean, look at poor Green Lantern on the left there, leaning over on his giant construct just to stand up. So that's why we had to develop a brand new system that would work with both pegs or figures without holes that could then slip into the stand. It wasn't the greatest solution in the world because these wound up being kind of bulky since they had to incorporate the top half of the slipper as well, if you will, as the bottom part of the flat stand. And it's really important to collectors that the stand take up as little room as possible. That's why flat, usually clear stands that can be the smallest possible diameter tend to be the most popular because, again, they take up the least amount of space on the shelf. If your stand is extending beyond the action figure base, well, now you're displaying a base more so than a figure. And hey, that's something you can do too. I mean, Star Wars did that with their very first launch, and the base was actually something that had an action feature where you could move the figures around as long as they were connected to that peg. I remember pegs being a huge part of Star Wars collecting in the 80s, not just with the different stands that you could buy, like the display arena, but things like the Dagobah playset and a lot of the vehicles included peg holes, like the Falcon. I mean, it was a playset itself, and the peg holes are what allowed the figures to stand in specific spots without falling over. As a kid, this was one of my favorite features because it kept them in the action, and I wasn't just dealing with figures lying on the ground all the time. I really missed lines that didn't have this. Now, fast forwarding into the modern line, collectors tend to want more perfect flat surfaces that are exact replicas of what was in the movie, which is understandable why something like the sail barge doesn't have pegs like the vintage Millennium Falcon did. Although, honestly, I was kind of expecting it would. But as a HasLab item I didn't personally invest in, I can't really have too strong of an opinion because my money wasn't on the line. But just as a collector, I thought, oh, it's interesting. No peg holes. I was kind of expecting there might be pegs. But A good example where you can see the differences with the skiff, the new one having no peg holes versus the original one, as kids, had several, not just on the plank that Luke is standing on, but throughout it, so the figures, again, wouldn't just topple over every time you move the vehicle. Some vehicles would get peg holes for the feet in bikes, others you could just keep with a T-bar like the speeder bike, although I always appreciated when there were actually peg holes that kept the foot position to the brake pad or wherever the foot was supposed to be, and actually including them. And I've missed these in a lot of modern figures. Marvel Legends does pegs really rarely. Sometimes only when I guess you have to have it, like a character like Silver Surfer on a board. The peg is invaluable to keeping him on that board, especially if you want him floating in midair in kind of a flying pose. But one of the problems is the current Silver Surfer only has one peg on his board, so you can only have his front or his back foot stuck down to the board. The other one, well, times I have boards that kind of fall off because they're only held on by one peg, and I have my Silver Surfer posed in a sort of a cosmic flying moment. So, yeah, I think sometimes pegs really need to be incorporated more. We've had Silver Surfers in the past that have had two pegs on the board, and yeah, the figure stands better. Honestly, it really makes a difference. That new Sky Cycle that Hawkeye had doesn't have any peg holes at all. So yeah, you're sort of lucky to get anything these days that's got a actual peg on it. That's not a aftermarket stand, but maybe that's where the future is. What do you guys think? Do you think pegs are going to make a comeback in toys, or are they really just something that collectors want and it's only the aftermarket companies that are making product to backfill the holes that are in figures? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, thanks for sharing, and I'll see you in the next video.